All right, welcome back. This is Microeconomics, Chapter 9 on Monopolies. This is one of my favorite. I love this chapter. Okay, so if you want to take out the notes that I provided after you've sort of read and looked through the notes, we'll get started in just a second so you can get settled. All right. So a monopoly is when a single firm produces all of a product in the market. And a monopoly in general is theoretically, is realistically impossible, right? But there are close to monopolies on the planet, right? With say like diamonds, or fissionable material like nuclear material. But it is at least useful to think of monopolies, at least theoretically, so that we can learn some things about how it would work if monopolies were real, and we can get some insights into how near monopolies work in the real world, right? Okay, so a monopoly is when a single firm produces all of the output in a market. Because there's no competition in the market, they get to decide whatever the price is, at least subject to a demand curve, right? As you change the price, you're going to affect demand. And so you do have to still deal with that theoretical side, but you get to change the price instead of, as in the former chapter where we had perfect competition, the producer has no real effect on the price. Here, the producer decides the price, okay? And that's going to affect the demand. All right, so we will talk a little bit about Texas energy companies later in the chapter as an example of sort of monopolies and how monopolies can go devastatingly wrong, right? Monopolies are almost always, no, I would say always, monopolies are always a bad thing. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Not for the producer, right? And not for the CEO of a company who owns a firm with a firm grip on a monopolized market, because they can determine the price, right? And they can manipulate the price and demand and things of that sort. So monopolies are always bad, but we will talk about some contemporary examples and why they can go devastatingly wrong at the end. All right, section 9.1, how monopolies form, barriers to entry. So there's a lot here that I tried to, in the notes, sort of synthesize. It was spread out all over the place, so I tried to put it all into really easy to understand little pieces for each part. So hopefully that's helpful, right? Because I think the book in this chapter was, while it hit all the key points, it sort of mixed different points in different subsections, and it was a little bit frustrating. So hopefully this helps. So natural monopolies. These are barriers to entry in a market from something other than a legal prohibition, right? And this is generally due to a combination of economy of scale and the size of the market, and this is all about the cost, right? The cost of entry, a lot of times, when it's not a legal monopoly. So the vast majority of the costs in these industries are in the sunk cost side, right? These are high sunk cost industries where actually producing the product, once you actually put all of the investment inputs in and build the factory and hire the labor and do all the training and buy the machinery and whatever it is, once all of that has been sunk, it's relatively inexpensive, right, to build whatever product it is. The problem is that there's such a vast, huge barrier to entry in the cost side, the sunken cost side. So let me give you some examples. This would be like the airplane industry, right? There's not a lot of demand for the airplane industry. There is, but it's limited. It's very finite, right? There's a set number of airplanes that the world needs or that the industry needs, and even right now that's decreasing. So the airline industry is sort of in trouble, especially given that engines are falling off of Boeings left and right. Apparently, the industry is in trouble, right? But the point is, it's a high sunk cost industry, right? It costs a whole lot of money to build the factory, buy all the machining equipment, hire the right engineers, do the R&D, and then build these enormous pieces of equipment when the world only really needs another, say, 2,000 per year. Right? I don't know what the real number is, but it's a finite number. And it would cost you so much to get into the market as a new airline producer that you wouldn't be able to make a profit, and eventually no one would make a profit because it would drive prices down, but there's only 2,000 planes being sold per year, and so you just dumped all this sunk cost into the system too, and now neither plane company can make a profit on what's happening. So this is a sort of a natural monopoly, and this is planes. This would also be usually public utilities like electricity companies. It costs a lot of money to run all those electrical lines. It costs a lot of money to put in all of the cities like sewer lines or plumbing lines, right? And so this is why you see sort of local monopolies and utilities. What was the last one I was thinking of? Chipmakers is a really hot one in the market right now. Chipmakers, it is an extraordinarily expensive, sunk costs type of industry. You have to build a massive factory. You have to hire really, really, really well-trained individuals to be able to build the chips. You need extremely precise and expensive equipment. You also need a 100% sort of micron-free, clean facility where everyone has to put on like 100% plastic and breathers so that there's nothing in the air, no hair, no dust, no anything in the air. It has to be perfectly sterile so that they can build these chips, right? Because apparently many of these chips even work on the atomic level where single electrons are being moved back and forth between a binary switch to remember data. And so you can imagine if a piece of dust gets on that circuit, it's non-functioning. It would be just completely destroyed. So these sorts of things, it's such an extremely high cost industry that there are really only 2 or 3 chip makers on the planet, 2 of which are in China, and sort of the Western world's chip maker is falling further and further behind technologically and equipment wise. And so it's sort of a hot topic right now. Should the U.S. and the EU sort of band together to try to have a competitive chip making market? Because Intel is falling desperately behind. Anyway, so lots of examples of natural monopolies where just the sunk cost side of it is so extraordinarily expensive that people can't, firms can't really get into the market. So that's planes, electricity, water. This can also happen sort of at the very micro level, on the local level, right? If you think about small hometowns, we only had one movie theater in our hometown, so they have sort of a natural monopoly. You'd have to drive 50 or 60 miles to go to the nearest movie theater. That means our theater can kind of generate their own prices, right? And they can put it to you if they want to. This can also happen with low-income housing. A lot of the newer studies are finding that on the local level, I don't know how I want to phrase this. Purchasers of low-income housing will purchase up sort of all of the units in the area, or maybe 2 or 3 purchasers, and they will collude and sort of agree to raise rents, or they act sort of as slumlords, this sort of thing. So this is a new rising phenomenon too, apparently, that's just sort of beginning to be studied with the rise in housing costs and the serious supply side problem with the housing facilities or the housing market in America. Okay, car dealerships were my other example at the local level, right? If you live in a small town, there might only be one car dealership and then one used car dealership. Often it's owned by the same people, and they know that you have to drive 80 or 100 miles or whatever to the nearest competing car dealership, and so they know that they can bump up that price a little bit, right? And so you get this local monopoly effect. And while it might not be, of course, it's not a monopoly, on the grand scale. It's that micro level monopoly that can actually cause serious inefficiency problems in your local markets, right? So it's something that a lot of microeconomists like to study these days, especially this sort of hot housing market topic. And then we have physical resources, oil, diamonds. Lithium is a really hot topic right now. These are things where it's inefficient to have more than one mining company doing this, right? Especially in some of these smaller countries, like Central African Republic or Bolivia, which is listed down below. There's generally only a contract with one mining company. There's a really big one out of Australia that kind of leads the charge in the free market side of that. But then there's also a lot of these countries will run these mining facilities as a nationalized facility, right? They'll be withdrawing oil or diamonds or gemstones or lithium, and they'll say it's for the state and for the people, but that's often BS. And we'll talk about that later too, the resource curse. But I do want to talk about the lithium market. This is one of these markets that is problematic. Lithium, the largest deposits on Earth. It's really rare. First of all, it's a rare earth material, and the largest deposits on Earth are in Afghanistan, China, and Bolivia. 3 incredibly problematic countries, and this is one of the main components necessary in the new battery revolution, right? In electric cars, in high-level batteries, in solar collection batteries, even. How do you translate that solar energy into energy that we can use in the long run? Lithium is a major component in that, and it's going to be a major component growing and growing and growing in at least the medium term. The demand for lithium is going to keep growing, especially now with GE's decision to move everything toward electric, this sort of thing. I'm considering investing in lithium if I can find a sort of free market company that's involved. But like I said, Bolivia, which is very far left, Evo Morales is sort of a really problematic leader. He's the one who's suggesting that Bolivia should be able to sell cocaine legally to the rest of the world, and I don't know what your ideas are on that are, but I'll just sort of leave it hanging there. China, of course, is America's biggest natural competitor, market competitor, philosophical competitor, governmental competitor, strategic. I mean, just name an area, and China is our real competitor, I would say. And then Afghanistan is just sort of a shit show, honestly. It's completely falling apart. It's led by religious fanatics. There is a civil war. There are bombings and IEDs, improvised explosive devices, all over the country. Children and girls are kept from going to school. these places are problematic places, and the fact that Western countries are sending vast amounts of money into these states so that they can buy their lithium is problematic, right? Because we're sort of backing the wrong horse, I think, at least philosophically and morally. We'll see what happens in the future, but anyway. Again, this is another example of how a natural monopoly can occur with physical resources. So those are the natural monopolies. We have this sort of combination of economy of scale and size of market, which causes a difficulty of entering the market. And much of that is because of these sunk cost industries, right? Airline industries, electrical industries, this sort of thing. It can happen at the local level, like we talked about with car dealerships, low-income housing, and then the last one generally is physical resources, diamonds, oil, lithium, things of that sort. Then we'll move on to the other type of monopoly, which is a legal monopoly, and these are ones where the law prohibits or limits competition in this area, right? And this can be good or it can be bad. We'll talk about some of the consequences thereof also about this. So we have examples here. We have the utilities industries, right? Many times these are legal monopolies. In a lot of countries, the government runs these. In South Korea, electrical is run by the government. Plumbing is run by the government. Internet is provided by the government at an extraordinarily low cost and much, much more effective than American internet. And they pay like $2 a month. So they see it as a national investment in the long run to provide internet for their people because they think that it will help to bolster the economy. And from the research that I've seen, they're absolutely right. So some American cities are considering doing this. Okay, so utilities. Nuclear energy is another one, right? These are strategic industries. You can't just let any free market company come in and start digging up plutonium or uranium. At least, arguably, you cannot. I think all 193 nations on Earth prohibit the mining of plutonium or uranium. Also, the government is very, very much involved in regulating the nuclear energy side of things, the storage of nuclear material and fissionable and fusionable material, the cleaning of this material, the usage of it for nuclear weapons, etc. Right? So there are a lot of these sorts of things that the government has a strategic interest in limiting. How far this goes is the question, I guess, right? Should the government be involved in, say, oil production or energy production? Should the government be involved in building weapons? Should they be involved in, building airplanes? I mean, there's all kinds of different questions here, but I think most people can agree that like nuclear material probably should be off limits to anyone except for, maybe the military or serious scientists, that sort of thing. Okay. The Postal Service is another example. This is sort of a hot topic. The Postal Service is a legal monopoly, right? The United States government guarantees the Postal Service in the United States Constitution. There are numerous reasons for this. Pre-internet, this was the only way to communicate, really, right? Especially when the Constitution was being written. And the government was involved in this so that it could help to bolster the economy. It's sort of like what we were talking about earlier, South Korea providing internet to its people. This was sort of the U.S. government trying to provide internet to its people, right? Right off the bat. This is a way to make the economy efficient, to be able to create routes for messaging. It eventually turned into sort of the telegraph and telephone services But anyway, that was their intention to begin with. Today, the Postal Service is, I guess, politically hot. Um, it does tend to lose money, right? But most government programs do. That's why government programs exist, because they would either be impossible to provide on the free market level, or they would be exorbitantly expensive, right? And so this is one thing that the United States has decided would be exorbitantly expensive, right? And my example here is like, imagine grandma in Colorado in some tiny rural community living out in the backwoods, right? And she needs her medicine um, every every month or whatever it is. It would be exorbitantly expensive for her to get that medicine without the Postal Service in existence, right? And so that's sort of the, I guess, the ethical argument side of it. The economics side of it is that it's efficient. It's more efficient if you get all of these people from the urban areas sort of paying into the system at a really low cost because of the economies of scale, and because they're all so urbanized and close together and packed in. We can spread out that cost to the rural areas and help grandma get her medicine. So it's also really the only way. Like a lot of companies have secretly said in their documents, like UPS and some companies like this, that they would consider not even delivering to some areas. Like imagine some of the deeper areas in like Idaho or Montana or Alaska, right? Um, they don't really want to be involved in that, and because it's prohibitively expensive, and then eventually that would turn into them sort of gouging their customers, and then their customer base would fall out, which would further increase the gouging of the customers to keep those sort of supply lines and infrastructure lines open, which would cause more people to drop out, which means now there's only like 7 people from Alaska who use our service, and it costs them, $2,200 per delivery or so. I'm making up these numbers, but that's the sort of the sort of rotating, spiraling problem that you would get if you tried to just service some of these really rural places on the free market, right? So that's the argument. Okay. Boo, 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 boo. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, we talked about some of these things, the subsidies from the government, and there are many reasons for this. Efficiency in the economy, and that's sort of the Postal Service side that we touched on, or even the provision of internet by South Korea. Universal service at equivocal cost, which is what we talked about too, sort of spreading out the cost from the urban areas to the rural areas to make sure grandma gets her medicine. National security reasons. This is going to be fissionable material, tanks, Bell helicopters. The U.S. government often sort of funds some of their projects and research and development and things like this, or will guarantee purchases from them so that they know that they have a particular profit margin, right? Innovation, promotion, and reduction of costs, right? This is another reason that the government would subsidize something, to make sure that there's a guaranteed purchaser so that they know they can put in the research and development, so that they know they can buy their new equipment, so that sort of in some of these more nationally strategic markets, like the people who build artilleries. That's I believe that one is funded by the Swiss military. They make the best artillery on Earth. In the United States, we have Bell helicopters, and I don't remember who makes our tanks, but the U.S. government guarantees purchases and funnel subsidies in their direction. So even though it's quote unquote a free market company, and they are selling equipment to the larger world for war or for defense, it's not necessarily a free market, right? But there are reasons for that. Okay, the last is intellectual property rights. We should talk about this stuff too, because this is also a legal monopoly for the owner that is meant to help to bolster research and development and innovation and invention and art and all of these sorts of things for the nation of the United States. So, and this is actually written straight into the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. They talk about intellectual property rights. They talk about patents and things like this because they were thinking right off the bat, like they knew intellectual property rights, even way back then in the 18th century, were vitally important because people were writing books for the first time and they're selling them. They're selling their pamphlets. You're seeing the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, and they know that there's a lot of this sort of intellectual property right theft, which is a problem that we have today even, is intellectual property right theft. And so they saw, even when they were writing the original Constitution, they saw the need for protection of intellectual property rights. So patents have a 20-year guarantee in the United States. There are millions of patents in the United States. Trademarks is a little bit more squishy, right? Trademarks says a firm can renew a trademark repeatedly so long as it remains in active use, right? So this is going to be like the Nike check. Arguably, this is Superman the character. And arguably, this is Mickey Mouse, right? Because there have been some really hot lawsuits recently about this exact topic. Does Disney still own the rights to some of their original characters? Does DC and Marvel Comics eventually? Because Marvel has only really existed since like 1961, so they haven't hit that barrier, but they will in the next decade or so. But does DC have sole rights to their characters, like their original characters, like Batman, Superman, Spectre, Green Lantern, the ones that came out in like the early 1940s and late 1930s? They've already hit that sort of 70-year copyright, and they're way past that 20-year patent. And so they are arguing that they're in that trademark territory, that sort of like squishy, repeated trademark because it stayed in active use, right? So it's a really interesting argument that they have. And so far, the bigger companies like Disney and DC Comics, who is backed by Universal and some massive media conglomerates, they have won their cases, whereas smaller trademarks have lost their cases. And so there's a little bit of frustration in sort of the economic and even the law reviews about unfair treatment in the United States judicial system if you have billions of dollars and your DC, or your Disney, Disney Inc., they're being treated differently than some other companies. So it'll be very interesting to watch in the near future as a lot of the newer modern stuff from the 1950s, 1960s starts to hit that 70-year copyright. Do they fall? They're going to want to argue that they fall into that squishy trademark area, whereas competitors and publishers and media makers and cartoonists and just consider the possibilities. They're going to want to say, no, that's copyright. The 70 years is over. Now it's public domain, and so it's going to be really fun to watch. And I wonder, is it going to fall out where moneyed interests win and those without resources lose, like often happens in the American system, or will courts start to recognize some of these law review complaints about, look, this is completely unfair and it's a systemic problem in the American judicial system. So keep watching. Okay. Some ideas I thought for your papers, some interesting ideas for the micro course. Are these numbers efficient, especially in the modern economy, right? a lot of the reason that we have these copyrights and trademarks are so that they can't be copied for 20 years, and you get to keep sort of your trade secrets. But given how fast the economy moves now and how fast the technology moves, and old technology gets left behind like that, is 20 years too long? So something to think about. Should it be different for different industries, right? Should it be different for sort of the high technological industries like Apple, Google, Alphabet, these sorts of industries, Intel, Texas Instruments, where their industry moves really quickly, versus, say, books, where, you're probably not actually going to get a whole lot on your book anyway as an artist, unless you're, the New York Times bestseller. And so is that 70 years more reasonable there, I think that would be a really interesting topic too. Is there too much legal protection for the big and powerful companies like Disney and DC Comics that doesn't exist for smaller trademarks, copyrights and patents? Is this a problem that we need to be that maybe the legislatures even need to look at, or should maybe judges be more careful about who is getting what treatment, right? So anyway, just some things I thought about. Like, these are some interesting questions about this topic that you might want to consider researching and delving a little deeper into for your paper. Okay, the last one we should talk about is predatory pricing, right? This is one of the negatives that happens from monopolies. Monopolies have an incentive, firms have an incentive to use predatory prices to try to build a monopoly in and of themselves, right? And Walmart in particular has been accused of this over and over and over, not only in the Americans by or in the United States by mom and pop stores during sort of the 80s and 90s, during the Walmart revolution, to sort of the local American economy, but also in companies more recently like Mexico, Brazil, and sort of these South American countries where Walmart's trying to become a new entrant into the market, and is arguably predatory pricing, making their products so cheap that they're driving out their competitors who have to close up shop, and then they drive their prices up once they've built up a monopoly. And so there's a lot of fear that this is happening all over the third world. There's also a lot of fear that this is happening on the American local economy, not only from Walmart, but from companies like Dollar General, Dollar Tree, sort of providing these garbage products. I shouldn't say that sort of providing these inferior products and driving out local merchants so that they can, hawk their wares on every corner in the United States. So, some other interesting questions you might want to dive into. Oh, last point. Sometimes advertising is thought of this way as predatory pricing. Rather than actually driving them out through pricing, they just deluge the market with advertising. And so politicians, especially incumbent politicians, are guilty of this. But also major, vast corporations like, think of the beer market, right? Budweiser, Miller Lite, Coors Light, Bud Light. These sort of this very small number of producers compared to the number of producers in the market, right? We're talking like 4, right? Bud, which is Anheuser, Miller, Coors, like the 3 I can think of. These 3 versus maybe the 1,000 or 10, probably 10,000 different small beer manufacturers in America. They own the vast majority of the advertising space in America. So they're sort of forcing out competition by just forcing themselves out into the airwaves. All right. The last point here in this section, They provide a nice little table here with barriers to entry, the government, whether the government has a role and what is it, and an example of these things. The one that I disagree with is the control of a physical resource. And does the government have a role? They say no. I say that's absolutely wrong. The government does have a role. Why is that? And you can see this below. First of all, the government has to give you land rights, right? And so the government is involved right off the bat. Often, the state itself decides we're going to extract this. We'll buy the equipment. We'll hire the people, or just like force them to work, as happens in many countries. Um, and we'll actually run this industry ourselves and throw our stuff out there on the market, right? And sell this stuff ourselves, and we'll call it, for the people, and we'll tell you we're going to buy infrastructure and stuff like that. But it generally just turns into cronyism, and theft. But the government has a role there, right? They often run it themselves, or they have to provide you with the land rights. There are also rare earth mineral ideas and needs that need to be taken into consideration as well, right? In the new techno boom and battery boom that we're going to see in the future, rare earth minerals are even more and more and more in demand over time, right? And these include things like magnesium, lithium, I don't know. I mean, basically any metal on the periodic table that isn't up there in those, unstable metals at the very top of the list, the dense metals. We need all of them for all kinds of different technological components, circuitry, computers, cell phones, many, many, many different products, especially batteries, for cars. So, many countries, including China, Russia, the United States, the big players, the BRICS, and even the EU, have restrictions on on what you can export, even, right? If we have access to lithium or plutonium, we're not going to allow you to sell those to other countries. We're probably not even going to allow you to dig it up out of the ground. We'll do that ourselves. We'll take care of it. So there are national, strategic, and industry necessities that need to be looked over by the government, whatever government it might be. So that's something else you need to take into consideration. We also have national strategies when it comes to things like oil. The United States has their own laws on oil extraction. It has its own whole national policy on what is our foreign policy and economic stance as to whether we want to purchase oil, whether we want to move toward renewable resources, how we want to subsidize oil companies and oil extraction. Do we want to provide money for R&D for oil extraction? The government is highly involved in these things, right? And they can affect whether there's a legal monopoly or these sorts of things. Finally, I would point out state extraction, which we've talked a little bit about. Consider the countries that are highly involved and reliant on extraction materials, right? You've got Central African Republic with diamonds and emeralds. You've got Venezuela with oil. You've got Saudi Arabia with oil. You've got Nigeria with diamonds and oil. Mexico has oil. These are not nice places, right? There is something called the resource curse, where states, governments, are the ones who are extracting these resources and purportedly providing the resources back to their people. But instead what happens is you get high levels of cronyism, and you get the state using those resources to pay off critics or to kill them, as in the case of bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and maybe some of these other places. What happens is these resources, there's no reason for the government to provide you, to listen to your feedback as a citizen, right? Um, I don't need to extract taxes from you now to be able to provide things like infrastructure, or to be able to pay my own salary as a leader, or to provide the military, or to provide a police force to control you. The only thing that I need is to pull that stuff out of the ground and sell it. And so there becomes this disconnect between the citizenry and what they need and want, and the leadership. And I think in some ways America is at least slightly involved in this sort of thing. But this resource curse is a real problem that we see across the world. And lithium is the new example, I think, at least the new hot example, where countries like Bolivia, which is having sort of ethnic violence and revolution, and imprisoning its former leaders. You have Afghanistan, which is a complete nightmare, and the America doesn't know really whether we want to be involved anymore, even though we know it's going to collapse if we're not. America has sort of lost its taste for it, right? Because we're so sick of thinking about it. It's been 20 years we've been involved in Afghanistan. But these are the hotspots where resources are extracted, and the governments don't really care what the people think, because they don't need to, right? So take that into consideration. All of this to say, the idea that government doesn't have a role in physical resources is just wrong. I don't know where they got that from. Maybe it's a typo. Okay, section 9.2, how a profit-maximizing monopoly chooses output and price. So, in the former chapter, we were talking about perfect competition. Here, we're talking about the exact reverse, right? There's no competition in the market. So, in the A graph, this is a market where there's perfect competition. See, this is farming, where no matter what quantity you put out, you can't affect the price, you can't affect profits, you can't affect anything really, right? So you should just put out the production that will maximize your profit. Your idea is still to maximize your profit under a monopolistic system, right? But now you do affect the demand for the product. And so where you set your price point affects what your revenue as a company is, which affects your profit margin. And so you need to figure out, how do I manipulate the market to maximize my profit margin? Here below it says the incentive above is for the monopolist to manipulate the market, keep supply artificially low, and thus keep the price and the concomitant profits as high as possible. If you look at figure 9.4, we've got total revenue versus total costs. As we produce more and more of something, the total costs are going to rise. Sorry, there's someone at my door. I want to make sure they're not knocking. Okay, so back to figure 9.4. As we decide to make more of a product, right? It's going to cost us more and more as we make it. Remember, we have a sunk cost, which is why we never really get down to zero. But then as we produce more and more of a product, demand will be reduced, right? Excuse me. This will change the price of the product. And so not only are our costs increasing eventually due to reducing marginal return, but also your revenue will start to go down because you're affecting demand. So this is a dual problem that we'll see. If you look at figure 9.5, marginal revenue and marginal cost, as you move over in your production units, from 1 through 8 on this graph. From 1 through 3 to 4-ish, your costs per unit are dropping, right? This is because you're making more profit per unit before your costs start to rise as your marginal costs or your diminishing returns start to kick in. So as we move quantity out, our marginal costs eventually start to rise back up, right, as you get diminishing returns. And so that means our marginal revenue is also decreasing, and our marginal revenue can turn negative under the case of a monopoly, because eventually if you start putting out so much of your product on the market, demand drops so low that price has to drop so low that eventually it costs you more money to make the product than you can sell it for. So here, as you can see, the equilibrium point on this is about 5,000 or 5 million or whatever it is, because we're talking about pills here. So say 5 million. We want to produce 5 million of this, given the demand curve and given the price. This is our equilibrium maximum possible profit at 5, where the revenue stream and the marginal costs cross. All right, and if you sort of put all of this onto a singular graph, you get figure 9.6, right? Again, you see what we saw above with marginal cost and our marginal revenue, and these two cross at 5 again. We also see here they've added the demand curve, right? And as we produce more and more of a quantity, our demand starts to drop. We see that on the curve. They've also added a marginal revenue curve, where as the quantity increases, we're having to reduce the price and demand is decreasing, right? So our marginal revenue drops even further than our demand curve. And so if you go to our equilibrium point where marginal cost and average cost meet at 5 million pills or whatever, and you fly it up to total profit, that is where your total profit is going to be, and that is our maximization of our total profit. Okay, the last piece I want to look for here. Monopolies are always allocatively inefficient. While they might, for a very, very short while, be productively efficient, actually be on that production frontier curve, they will never be allocatively efficient. And this is because there will always be a mismatch between demand and supply. The firm provides a good at a higher price to consumers and a lower output to the market. So consumers, if it were allocatively efficient, consumers would pay less if there was competition in the market, and the correct output would match demand on the market. But instead, under a monopoly, the monopolizing firm decides to manipulate and short the output in the market, right? They are not meeting the actual demand in the market. They are trying to manipulate it to increase their profit. So consumers pay a higher price, and fewer consumers get their hands on the product than would under a competitive system. There are also a lot of bad societal consequences in the long run, and we're going to talk about some of these too. First, a monopolized system means that there is less incentive in the market to develop new technology or to be reactive to consumer demands, right? If you're a company who has a monopoly on the market, and just like we were talking about with governments who have a monopoly on extractive resources, firms have no incentive to react to the purchaser's demands, right? They have no incentive to provide good customer service. They have no incentive to research new technology. They have no incentive to upgrade their facilities. They have no incentive to pay higher wages so that they can influence better labor and make a better product, right? So none of the wonderful incentives that markets provide normally under competitive circumstances are provided under a monopolistic circumstance. So you get less research and development. Um, Fewer people get the product in their hand at a higher price. Uh, Often new entrants who are trying to break into the market are squashed immediately, right? Either through sort of predatory pricing, or the new trend is to just snatch them up on the market, right? Just buy them up. Now I own them, and I can either just put this product out however I want it to look, or I can just completely bury it and pretend like it doesn't exist, right? Which is sort of what Alphabet and Facebook and these companies do, is they just snap up anything that could become a potential competitor, and they either throw it in the trash, or they just soak it up into their own system, or they run it, how they want to run it, which is not what made it popular to begin with, right? So that's also a problem. You get worse treatment of labor, and labor gets lower wages. You get really inefficient logistic and supply lines, and there's a lot less incentive to maintain and update your equipment. So monopolies all the way around are a bad thing, right? Actual competition and actual free markets are phenomenal. They distribute information. They are better for labor. They are better for the consumer. They offer better prices. They offer better research and development, and new efficiencies and new technologies and new equipment, and all the way around, free markets are the better system. So keep that in mind. Have a wonderful week. I really hope you enjoyed. I like this chapter a lot, so I hope you enjoyed. Have a great week. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you soon, okay?